Well, good Sunday morning to you. Thank you for tuning in today. We're in Mark chapter 10, verses 32 through 45. And so if you have a Bible, I invite you to turn to that. We're going to study this passage together. Now, I have to confess that I spent a good bit of time today trying to record this sermon outside. And it was beautiful. It was a beautiful day this Saturday. And just did not work. There were people coming through the parking lot, and there was highway traffic and birds, and by the time it quieted down long enough, it just was too dark. And so here we are back in this room with my cello that I don't really play very well. It's not just a decoration. I did take lessons a year or two ago, but I don't play good enough to play in front of people. So anyway, here we are back in my office, and I'm probably getting a little weary of this. Last week I texted a guy in our church, and I just said, "Hey man, I'm getting sick of preaching to myself in my office, and so maybe someday you can come over here and just let me preach to you if this quarantine stuff keeps going." But welcome to our online worship. We're glad that you're tuned in today. This morning we're going to look at Mark chapter 10, verses 32 through 45. And we've been looking at the Gospel of Mark for quite a while. And we've been in Mark chapter 10 now since I think our first sermon in Mark chapter 10 was the beginning of March, which seems like about 18 weeks ago. But we are continuing to go section by section through the Gospel of Mark, and it's my prayer and my hope today that the Lord speaks to you through His Word. Well, let's turn our attention to Mark chapter 10, verses 32 through 45. It says, "They were on the road going up to Jerusalem." It's an incline. Jericho area around the Dead Sea and the Jordan River is lower in elevation, and so when it says they're going up to Jerusalem, they are climbing a hill. Climbing a mountain, and so they're going up to, on the road, going up to Jerusalem. They're not quite to Jericho yet, and Jesus is walking ahead of them, and listen to the response from the disciples. In verse 32 it says they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. So Jesus' disciples are still amazed at his encounter with the rich young ruler and Jesus' teaching on salvation. And there are various groups of people that just follow Jesus. Some are his supporters, some are those who are not yet disciples, some are family members of his disciples, and some are just parts of the crowd that kind of hang around when Jesus comes through. And so there are a large number of people following him at any given time. But in the midst of this situation, it says that Jesus takes the 12 again. That's the apostles. There are many disciples, only 12 apostles. So Jesus turns to the 12 apostles, verse 32, and he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." And James and John, verse 35 says, Zebedee came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." And Jesus said to them, "You don't know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Well, this is the passage that we're going to focus on this morning. This is Jesus' third time to predict and give the details of his crucifixion. He adds a lot more details this time. And just on the heels of him telling his 12 apostles about what's going to happen in Jerusalem, for some reason James and John, and Matthew tells us their mother, come up to Jesus in that moment and make this unusual request. Now, this is bad timing to say the least. So I have to ask you the question, have you ever said the wrong thing at the wrong time? Or have you ever put your foot in your mouth, as the saying goes? Or maybe you say the right thing or an okay thing, but you say it at exactly the wrong time. The news has been dominated, at least the sports news this week, has been dominated by pitcher Blake Snell, who this year was estimated to make about $7 million as a pitcher for the Rays. And this week he went on to really publicly complain about how unfair it would be for him to take a loss and for him to go out and work and expose himself to great risk playing baseball for a pay cut. And, I don't have an opinion necessarily about whether he's right or wrong on that issue, but I can tell you one thing. Publicly complaining about losing a portion of your $7 million contract to play baseball when a huge percentage of our nation is losing money and employment and their loss of freedoms and all these kinds of things that are taking place, that's not really a great way to get a lot of sympathy for yourself, for this pitcher. Whether he said the right thing or the wrong thing, that could be debated, but it definitely was terrible timing to complain about the loss of a few $1,000,000 under the circumstances and to the audience that you're, sort of complaining to. Now, I've definitely had my fair share of saying the wrong thing under some circumstances. I've said the wrong thing at the wrong time. I've said my fair share of embarrassing things. I won't go into a lot of detail. But when you speak publicly as much as I do, you're bound to have some mistakes and some misspoken times and say things you don't mean and maybe later go back and say, oh, I can't believe I said that or said it in that way or said it to that person, but that's kind of life, and we all do that. We all think things, and sometimes they just come out of our mouth. We blurt them out without really thinking about the consequences or the audience or anything. And so our text today includes an example of just really James and John saying something ridiculous. But it really gives Jesus an opportunity to further teach and clarify what it means to be a disciple. Jesus is not fazed by their question, and he redirects the attention of all the disciples before they're able to be furious and lynch these two guys. Jesus zeroes in on helping them understand, what does it mean to be a Christ follower? What does it mean to follow him and to be one of his disciples? So my pastoral prayer and my goal for you today is that you would have a clearer understanding of what it means to be a Christ follower rather than just a cultural Christian. You see, there are plenty of people who have gone to church all their life and they're moral people, but they're not Jesus followers. They haven't made Jesus the Lord of their life. They wouldn't be considered disciples of Jesus. So I want to clarify, what does Jesus mean when he calls his disciples to follow him in these committed ways? And then secondly, that's my first goal for you, is that you would have a clearer understanding of the call to discipleship. And then the second thing is that my hope and prayer for you today is that you will have a deeper love and a deeper appreciation for Jesus and for the cup of wrath that he drank and the work that he accomplished for us on the cross. So it's my prayer that that comes across to you this morning. And so let's get back into our text. Let's start back at verse 33, Jesus with his third passion prediction. He says, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man, that's Jesus' title for himself, He says the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. Now both Matthew and Mark and Luke, all three give these three predictions that Jesus gives his disciples. Typically they are directed toward the 12 apostles, and not just the entire group of disciples, but to the 12 apostles. The first prediction that we read about was in Mark chapter 8, verse 31 through 34. And in Mark chapter 8, it was right before Jesus went up on to the Mount of Transfiguration. Then after the Mount of Transfiguration, on their way back to Capernaum, Jesus is passing through Galilee quietly, and he gets into the house, and his disciples have been arguing along the way. Who is the greatest? And Jesus at that time also predicts his crucifixion and his death. This is the third prediction, and there are some similarities between the three predictions. All right, here's the similarities. The general gist of what Jesus explains remains constant, right? The general idea. He says in each episode, I'm going to be delivered over, I'm going to be killed, and then I'm going to rise after 3 days. Those are the three consistencies in each of the predictions, but each prediction adds a little bit of detail. In the second prediction, Jesus is delivered over to the hands of men, but in the third prediction, in this chapter here, it says that it would happen in Jerusalem, right? So the first two, the disciples may not have understood that Jesus was saying, we are going now to Jerusalem for me to be, for me to die. But now in this third prediction, Jesus says, we're going to Jerusalem, and I will be handed over to the religious leaders. So the disciples could have easily thought that this was a distant future event that Jesus was talking about. But now, this third prediction, it brings things sharply into focus. This is happening right now. We're going to Jerusalem right now. Secondly, and more detail is added in this third prediction. Jesus says, I will be delivered over to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn me over to death. Now, Tim Keller points out that this demonstrates that Jesus understood that he will be tried and convicted according to and within Israel's criminal justice system, and that he won't just be sort of secretly assassinated or some kind of made to look like an accident sort of thing, but that Jesus will be actually convicted by the chief priests and the scribes. Jesus also reveals details that they will not only convict him, but that they will hand him over to the Romans, the Gentiles, and then Jesus says they will mock me, spit on me, flog me, and kill me. Now that adds an entire new level of intensity when Jesus predicts that. And then Jesus also, in this passion prediction, tells them why. That's Mark 10:45. He says that I will die as a ransom for many. And then he also tells them that after 3 days I will rise again. So let's get into some of these details, because he adds a lot of details in this passage. He says they're going to mock me, spit on me, flog me, kill me, and that I will rise. Now, in all these places we read, we're going to get to Mark chapter 15, but in Mark chapter 15, we see that after Jesus' trial with the chief priests and the high priest and the scribes, and after they condemn him and beat him, they hand him over to the Gentiles. And in Mark chapter 15, the soldiers lead Jesus inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. It says the whole battalion, and I had to look it up. A whole battalion is about anywhere between 500 and 600 soldiers. Now, I don't know how long it takes to assemble a battalion. I imagine if it's the early morning and they're all sort of in bunk headquarters there, that maybe somebody blew a bugle or something, and this battalion could be gathered relatively quickly. But it says that they gathered the entire battalion, which is about 500 soldiers. And with all of those soldiers, they began to mock him. They clothed him in a purple cloak. They twisted together a crown of thorns and they put it on him. Now, one time in 1990-something, I was on spring break and I was fly fishing with a bunch of friends on the White River in North Arkansas. And we were hiking through the woods in this beautiful area, and I came across a thorn bush with thorns about 2 or 3 inches long, really thick thorns. And one afternoon I just was meditating on this passage, and I went out there and I began to twist together a crown of thorns. And what I found is that it took me a long time. It took me a long time to do it. I had to put a lot of effort into it, and in the process of doing it, I got cut. I got cut a lot of times. It was sharp and it was painful, and so it just gave me insight into the fact that for them to do all of this, it was somewhat organized, and they took time and they made effort. They really went out of their way to mock Jesus and to mess with Jesus and to inflict pain, unnecessary pain on Jesus. They put a robe around him and put this crown of thorns on his head, and they beat him and they spit on him. It says they began to salute him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they began to strike his head with a reed. And they began to spit on him and kneel down to him in this sort of fake homage to him. And after they mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak. They put his own clothes back on him, and then they led him out to crucify him. We also understand from this time that he was also flogged. Flogging was the Roman punishment of 39 lashes with a whip that had embedded in it bits of rock and bone and other things that would not be good for Jesus' flesh. It was just a very painful thing. But Jesus knew all this. He's telling his disciples, this is what's directly ahead of me. I'm going to be mocked, I'm going to be spit on, I'm going to be flogged, and I'm going to be killed. And the rest of the Gospels bear this out. Now, this is a prediction that happened long ago. Isaiah 50, verse 6, about 700 years before Jesus, it's written in that prophecy that I gave my back to those who strike me and my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from disgrace and spitting. Understanding that Jesus knew what was going to happen and that he willingly subjected himself to this treatment when at any moment, as he said in the Garden of Gethsemane, I could call down legions, multiple thousands. I could call down legions of angels to protect me and to deliver me out of this, but he willingly endured this. So Jesus continued to go through this mocking and spitting. Coincidentally, if you were to look up the word spit in the Bible, it is some of the most disgraceful treatment that could take place. It's only mentioned a few times where people will spit on somebody, but to spit in someone's face was a massive disgrace in that culture. Coincidentally, Job speaks of mocking and spitting, and we know that Job suffered greatly. So Jesus, a concentration of spitting and mocking someone is found only in the lives of Job and Jesus, which shows you the great level of suffering that he went through. So Jesus communicates this detail of what he's facing. They're on their way to Jerusalem right now to experience this. And after Jesus tells the apostles what's coming, that's when we get this weird request from James and John. It says, verse 35, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." Well, what a weird way to start a prayer, right? Can you just imagine, Lord, I humbly come to you, do exactly for me whatever I tell you, right? This is the least humble way and the most selfish way to approach Jesus. And Jesus says to them, well, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left. This is the most ridiculous request that I can imagine, and the worst timing on the heels of what Jesus just said. I'm going to be spit upon and mocked. I'm going to be beaten. I'm going to be killed. And after 3 days, I'm going to rise again. And just as soon as Jesus has finished saying those words, these two, James and John, they're called sons of Zebedee, and Matthew's gospel, Matthew 18, I believe, says that their mother came with them, and she's the one who helped make the request as well. What's going on here? Why would they make this request, and why would they do it in this way and at this time? Now, we know who James and John are. They're considered as part of Jesus' inner circle of the top sort of three apostles, right? We have the disciples, and then among the disciples there are 12 apostles, and then among the 12 apostles there are 3 that went up with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, right? Peter, James, and John. So they're already sort of in this elevated position of favor with Jesus. For some reason, they leave Peter out of this request, and they're already trying to set themselves apart from all the other disciples. Why do they want to be on Jesus' left and right when he comes in his glory? Are they vying for power? Do they want more authority? Are they looking for prestige and position or some sort of political authority when Jesus comes in his power? I don't understand it, but I love Jesus' response to them. Verse 38, Jesus just says, "You have no idea what you're talking about. You don't even know what you're asking." And then he said, he makes a statement, asks a question, then he makes another statement. You don't know what you're talking about. That's the statement. Then he asks the question, can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink? Or can you be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized? And they said to him, we are able. And then Jesus said, you're right. You're going to drink the cup that I'm going to drink, and you're going to go through the baptism that I'm baptized with. But you can't sit at my right hand or my left. It's not my position to grant those positions. It is for those to whom it has already been prepared. Now listen, if I'm Jesus and these guys ask me this in that moment, I would get angry. I would probably get flustered. I would rebuke them for being selfish. But Jesus doesn't do any of that. He doesn't get angry. He doesn't get flustered. He doesn't rebuke them. He doesn't pout or walk off upset. He doesn't roll his eyes at Zebedee's wife for asking about her 2 sons. Jesus is amazingly patient with them. I mean, he's facing this reality of death and suffering, and 2 of the 12 apostles are selfishly seeking this future position. It's kind of like a family waiting for someone to die, and they're just sort of callously waiting for the inheritance. But Jesus is unflappable. He shows complete calmness. He's collected, and he's really deliberate in his response. You don't know what you're asking for. You're not going to be able to go through what I'm about to go through, and you are going to suffer and go through some pain and suffering, but you can't have the position. Now, Tim Keller also pointed out a really good insight that there are 2 people at Jesus' right hand and his left hand in his moment of glory. But it's not what you think, is it? Now, who is at Jesus' right hand and his left hand when he is in his moment of greatest glory? Well, it's the thieves on the cross. It's these criminals that are crucified next to Jesus on his right and on his left. These are 2 who are occupying a position when Jesus is in this glorious position of self-sacrifice and humiliation, which leads to, according to Philippians 2, the exaltation of Jesus and him having a name that is to be glorified and the name above all names. That's Jesus' greatest position of glory, is his humiliation and his sacrifice for us. And there are people already there on his left and right. Jesus says, you will drink this cup. The cup is a metaphor for Jesus' future suffering. That's very clear in the Old Testament. If you were to look at Isaiah 51, Jeremiah 25, Jeremiah 49, Ezekiel 23, Habakkuk 2, Zechariah 12, basically all over the Old Testament, the prophets identify God's wrath as a cup that is to be drunk. They are to drink the cup of God's wrath. So in all these places, just by way of example, that Habakkuk 2:16 passage says, you will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink and show the uncircumcision of your hearts. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. So the cup is a depiction of God's wrath, and it is poured out, or it is consumed when people experience the wrath of God. Now, doesn't that give us greater insight into what Jesus prays at the Garden of Gethsemane, right? He says, Father, if it is your will, take this cup from me. But not my will, but your will be done. And Jesus is required, Jesus is asked by God to drink the cup of his wrath. So Jesus then asked these two apostles, can you drink this cup of God's wrath and suffering? What does that mean? Well, if Jesus has to suffer so that people can be saved from their sins, he's essentially asking these apostles, can you suffer? If it requires your suffering for the gospel to be communicated and proclaimed, can you do that? Can you experience that so that the gospel will go out? That begs the question for us, right? This is maybe a great point of application. How willing are we to suffer? How willing are we to suffer so that the gospel goes out? I mean, would you drink a cup of suffering if you knew that as a result of your suffering, that the gospel would go out and many people would be saved? But all it would require of you is a bit of suffering. Listen, I don't think we deal with suffering very well. I think if you were to ask this question of believers in North Africa or in the Middle East, or those who are being actively persecuted for their faith in Jesus, they might have a different perspective on drinking the cup of wrath or suffering for the gospel so that people might be saved. I don't think we can read it in the same way that maybe other believers around the world experience it. But how do you think this request from James and John goes over with the other 10 apostles? Well, if you look at verse 41, it says, when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. They were furious. This is the ultimate power move, right? It's not enough for them to be chosen out of all the disciples, to be considered 12 apostles. It's not enough for them, James and John, to be in this sort of favored position with Peter, James, and John. Now they somehow coerce their mother, or their mother coerced them, that in this really random moment to come and ask Jesus if they could sit at his right and his left. So they were indignant. This is the ultimate power move, right? They want to rule over the other 10 disciples and apostles. Jesus, again, he responds really calmly with the truth to teach and clarify about what leaders look like in the kingdom. He uses this moment to clarify, what does it mean to be a follower? What does it mean to be a disciple of mine? He doesn't get on to James and John or the mother, but he just tells them. In verse 42, he calls them to himself, and he says to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. Whoever of you would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be the slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. After each prediction that Jesus has given, both in Mark 8 and in Mark 9, and also here in Mark 10, he clarifies and he teaches them what does it mean to be a follower of Christ. And in each one, he tells them essentially that you must deny yourself, that is, get rid of your selfishness. You must be willing to sacrifice yourself, that is, pick up your cross, and you must be willing to follow Jesus. And you can't be ashamed of Jesus. You must verbally confess that Jesus is Lord and verbally give testimony that you're a follower of Jesus. So you can't be ashamed of Jesus to be a follower of Christ. You must be willing to deny yourself, to not assert your authority over yourself or your own rights, but to willingly yield yourself to Jesus, to deny yourself, to sacrifice yourself, that is, to make continually sacrificial decisions so that the gospel can go out. In each one of these, he's telling them you must be last, you must be a servant, you must not be ashamed, you must follow me. And that's true in all of these. Jesus tells them in this passage here in 10:41 42 through 45. He says that those who are worldly leaders, they rule with authority and they lord it over people. They want you to know who the boss is. But if you're in the kingdom and you want to be great, then you have to be a servant. And you have to be as though you were the least of them to be the greatest and the most servant one. He'll clarify that again. You remember when they get to Jerusalem, right? He'll go through that again and he'll put on a towel and he'll wash the disciples' feet, showing them that, to be a follower, to be a leader, you have to be a servant. So there we are. We have these three predictions of Jesus' death that he gave to his disciples, and after each of these predictions, he also gave greater clarification as to what it would mean to be a disciple or a follower of Jesus. So what should we do in response to this passage? Because it would be really easy for us to ask, why didn't they get it? Why didn't James and John get it? Why didn't the disciples get it that Jesus has been telling them to be a servant, that Jesus has told them, to be the greatest, you have to be the least? Why, after already saying that twice, did James and John, come to Jesus and ask him how they could be elevated rather than how they could become more of a servant? And it's probably not a great question for us to ask, why didn't they get it? Because this passage gives us insight into how incredibly self-centered we can actually be. I mean, it would be really easy to think that these two disciples are unusual. But how many of us are so self-consumed or so self-centered that we often allow our own selfishness to get in the way of Jesus' call to servanthood and to be a humble disciple that serves other people? I have often been convicted, at times where I felt really ambitious and that my secret desire or that my motives behind a certain action would be for my own comfort or my own fame or for my own, financial blessing, or in some way I've just allowed ambition, natural ambition, to creep in. And one of the hints that it's ambition and it's an unholy thing is that I know that I don't pray those same things for other people, but I wish, really good things upon myself. And I was convicted a few years ago from Jeremiah 45:5 that says, "And do you seek great things for yourself? Seek them not." We must battle selfishness and actively embrace servanthood if we are to grow into the disciples that Jesus calls us. If we are to be true followers of Jesus, our prayer should be, Lord, help us not to be so incredibly selfish or self-centered, especially at this time when people all around us are hurting, and it would be easy for us to fall into a trap of thinking mostly about ourselves and our own situation rather than humbly serving others, especially because we have the light of the gospel. We can shine light in dark places. And so it would be really easy for us to focus on ourselves, but we should rise above that. Probably the last and more important thing that we should see from this passage is that we have a better indication of what Jesus' mindset was like just weeks, maybe 2 weeks before the crucifixion. He's, with each passion prediction, he's getting greater clarity on what he's about to go through. And our hearts should feel something for Jesus, and that now he knows he's going to go through a trial. He's going to be rejected. He's going to be turned over to a pagan nation to be tortured, and he's going to go through a fake trial where he doesn't have an opportunity to defend himself, and he's going to endure flogging and spitting and mocking and beating and crucifixion in Jerusalem. He's getting greater clarity on what he's facing. And he knows that the cup of suffering throughout the Old Testament and throughout the prophets the cup has meant the wrath of God. And so was he? Was it going to hurt for him to be mocked and spit on and go through a trial without the ability to defend himself? Was it going to hurt to be physically beaten? Was it going to hurt to be placed a crown of thorns on his head? Crucifixion? All those things were going to be terrible. I mean, really terrible. All those things were going to be bad, but none of those things are depicted in the cup of suffering more than facing the wrath of God. The wrath of God is a whole nother level of suffering, and Jesus had never experienced anything like that as a member of the Trinity, having been in fellowship and communion with God for all eternity. And so, reflecting on this passage should bring us to a position of gratitude that Jesus paid so great a price for us, to ransom us, to purchase our freedom. We don't understand Mark 10:45, even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. When we think of ransom, we think of a movie, or we think of kidnapped language, but this word ransom was pretty common. It was the word lutron, and it just simply meant to buy somebody's freedom. So you could buy a slave's freedom, or maybe you had a family member or a friend that was in prison. You could pay a fine, and you could purchase their freedom. And that's the word that Jesus said. I came to be the purchase price for your freedom. And you think of all that he suffered, the mocking, the beating, the spitting, all the things, the crucifixion and the cup of God's wrath. He did that all so that we could have freedom from sin and a freedom to have a relationship with God and to have life. As John 3:16 reminds us that God so loved us that he paid this price willingly for us. As Paul said to the Corinthians, that there's no greater love that man has than to lay down his life for his friends. This is what Jesus did for us, and this passage gives us just a little bit more understanding of what Jesus accomplished at the cross and on his way to Jerusalem. I hope you're encouraged by this word. I hope we're challenged to be less self-centered and to be more servant-minded. And I hope that we have a deeper love and appreciation and worship for Jesus as we understand more of what he suffered and prepared himself to suffer even at this time. Well, until we could worship again, I'm praying for you and looking forward to that day when we can worship the King together. So until then, may the Lord bless you, and may he cause his face to shine upon you, and may he give you peace.